He drew his bow to bring down a wild stag before it could destroy the harvest. But in a single terrible moment, the arrow struck the poor doctor's daughter instead. As she collapsed onto the rain-soaked forest floor, the young landowner's son realized one careless shot could change 2 lives forever. What he chose to do next would leave an entire town questioning everything they thought they knew about him. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if you enjoy heartwarming stories about kindness, courage, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. A cold spring drizzle settled over Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains in March 1892, cloaking the forest in drifting mist, while muddy trails disappeared beneath wet leaves and silent pines. Nathaniel Brooks guided his chestnut gelding through the dripping woods with practiced ease. At 24, he stood just over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered from years of riding and ranch work despite never needing to labor for a living. Thick dark brown hair curled beneath his weathered hunting hat, and a neatly trimmed beard framed the strong angles of his jaw. His steel blue eyes often appeared distant rather than proud, though few people cared to notice the difference. As the only son of the wealthiest landowner in the county, he had grown accustomed to whispered judgments. Most believed privilege had made him arrogant long before they had ever spoken to him. After years of hearing the same quiet resentment from neighbors and tenants alike, Nathaniel had stopped trying to defend himself. Silence demanded less energy than arguments that never changed anyone's mind. Ahead, an old stag emerged between towering oaks, its scarred antlers rising above the morning fog. The aging animal had destroyed young wheat fields for weeks, and several tenant families feared another failed harvest. Nathaniel slowly raised the longbow his late grandfather had carved decades earlier. He steadied his breathing, waiting for the perfect angle. Far deeper within the forest, Clara Bennett knelt beside a moss-covered log searching for wild ginseng. At 21, she was slender and graceful, with chestnut hair gathered into a simple braid beneath a faded bonnet. Her gentle hazel eyes reflected quiet determination, while her fair skin carried the light freckles of countless mornings spent beneath open skies. She was the only daughter of Dr. Samuel Bennett, the town's poor physician, whose small practice barely earned enough to purchase medicine. Since childhood, Clara had wandered these woods gathering herbs so her father could continue treating families who could rarely afford to pay. She carefully reached beneath a fern for a healthy root and stepped into a narrow clearing. Nathaniel saw movement. His heart lurched. He tried lowering the bow, but rain had soaked the leather glove around his fingers. The string slipped free. The arrow hissed through the damp air. The stag vanished into the trees. Clara turned only after hearing the sound. The arrow struck her left shoulder. She collapsed onto the rain-soaked grass without a cry. For one frozen heartbeat, Nathaniel could neither breathe nor move. Then horror shattered every thought in his mind. He sprinted across the clearing, dropped to his knees beside her, and saw blood slowly spreading across her worn brown cloak. Remembering an old hunter's warning, he resisted every instinct to pull the arrow free. Instead, he carefully shortened the shaft, slipped one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back, and lifted her into his arms. Ignoring the mud clinging to his boots and the weight of terrified guilt crushing his chest, Nathaniel turned toward the Bennett cottage nearly 2 miles away, determined to carry Clara there himself. Nathaniel Brooks reached the Bennett cottage breathless, his clothes soaked through and his arms trembling from carrying Clara nearly 2 miles across the rain-soaked hills. He kicked the wooden gate open with his boot and shouted for help, his voice cracking with panic before he even reached the porch. The front door flew open. Dr. Samuel Bennett stepped outside carrying a small oil lamp despite the afternoon light. At 62, he was a lean man with neatly combed silver hair, kind gray eyes behind round spectacles, and a closely trimmed white beard. Years of treating sick farmers, injured lumbermen, and poor families had bent his back slightly, yet nothing had ever weakened the calm steadiness in his hands. His worn brown coat had been patched more than once, but every stitch reflected the quiet dignity with which he lived. The physician needed only one glance to understand the emergency. "Lay her on the kitchen table," he said firmly. Nathaniel obeyed without hesitation. Only after Clara was inside did he find his voice. "I fired the arrow," he admitted, every word feeling heavier than the last. "It was meant for a stag. I never saw her until it was too late." Dr. Bennett did not answer immediately. His attention never left his daughter as he carefully examined the wound. He cut away the torn fabric surrounding her shoulder, exposing the broken shaft that remained lodged above the collarbone. "Thank heaven," he murmured quietly. "It missed the bone." Nathaniel remained perfectly still. "I know enough not to remove it," he said. "An old hunter taught me years ago." The doctor nodded once. "You remembered correctly." For the next hour, Nathaniel became whatever the physician needed him to be. He boiled water over the stove, carried fresh linens, held lanterns closer when daylight faded beneath heavy clouds, and steadied Clara's uninjured arm while the damaged arrow was carefully withdrawn. She never screamed. Only once did a quiet cry escape her lips before she bit down on it. Each sound struck Nathaniel harder than any punishment could have. When the wound was finally bandaged, Dr. Bennett washed the blood from his hands and looked toward the young landowner. "She will live," he said. "But the muscles have suffered. She must not lift anything heavy for several months." Nathaniel lowered his head. "Everything she has lost because of me I'll replace." The old doctor studied him for several silent moments. "I did not ask for payment, I know. I asked for honesty." Nathaniel met the older man's eyes. "You have both." By evening, word had already spread through the valley. People gathered quietly beyond the fence, whispering among themselves. Some pitied Clara. Others shook their heads, convinced the wealthy Brooks family would simply bury the matter beneath money. Nathaniel stepped outside before anyone could speculate further. Rain still dripped from the roof as he faced the small crowd. "My arrow struck Miss Bennett," he said clearly. "No servant fired it. No accident will be hidden. I alone bear responsibility." The murmurs stopped. He continued, "I will pay every medical expense. While Clara recovers, I will hire experienced herbal gatherers so Dr. Bennett may continue treating every patient who comes to this house. Any income the Bennett family loses because of my mistake will be restored." Several people exchanged doubtful looks. Old Martha Collins, a widowed seamstress whose sharp tongue was known throughout the valley, folded her arms. Nearly 70, she was short and sturdy, with silver hair tucked beneath a faded bonnet and eyes that missed almost nothing. Years of hardship had taught her to distrust promises from wealthy families. "We've heard fine speeches before," she said. "Words are lighter than feathers." Nathaniel accepted the rebuke without argument. "Then judge me by what I do tomorrow." He bowed his head slightly before returning inside. The following morning he returned exactly as promised. Not with servants, not with expensive gifts, only with several books borrowed from the church library, fresh bread from the village baker, and work gloves already worn from repairing fences on neighboring ranches during his younger years. Every day afterward followed much the same pattern. He read aloud while Clara rested because moving her shoulder exhausted her quickly. He sorted dried herbs under Dr. Bennett's direction, learning the difference between yarrow, comfrey, and wild ginseng despite confusing them repeatedly during the first week. He quietly replaced broken fence posts surrounding the cottage and climbed onto the leaking roof himself after discovering rainwater dripping into the attic. None of those tasks erased the memory of the arrow. Nathaniel knew they never could. Yet every evening before riding home through the darkening forest, he looked once toward Clara's window. The guilt inside him remained. But for the first time since the accident, Clara no longer saw only the hunter whose arrow had wounded her. She began to see the man who refused to run from the consequences of his own mistake. Spring gradually surrendered to early summer, and warm sunlight replaced the endless rain that had blanketed the Blue Ridge Valley for weeks. The muddy roads slowly hardened beneath wagon wheels, but the scars left by the storm remained everywhere. Nathaniel Brooks found himself riding those roads almost every day, though no longer with a hunting bow across his saddle. Instead, he carried notebooks filled with repairs that should have been completed years earlier, but had been ignored by estate managers more interested in profits than people. Before the accident, he had signed reports without asking questions. Now every neglected bridge, broken fence, and flooded lane reminded him how little he had truly known about the families living on his father's land. The road leading to the Bennett cottage became his first project. After watching Dr. Samuel Bennett's wagon sink into deep mud while transporting an elderly patient, Nathaniel hired local laborers rather than bringing workers from his own estate. Gravel was hauled from a nearby quarry, drainage ditches were dug by hand, and within 2 weeks the narrow forest road became solid enough for wagons to travel safely even after heavy rain. He refused to place the Brooks family name on any part of the work. If people must thank someone, he quietly told the foreman, thank the men holding the shovels. The story spread anyway. Soon afterward, Nathaniel unlocked one of the Brooks estate grain warehouses. The previous autumn had been difficult for several tenant families after repeated visits from wild deer ruined portions of their wheat. Instead of demanding payment, he distributed flour, cornmeal, and seed grain to families struggling to begin another season. He also established a permanent account with the town apothecary, ensuring Dr. Bennett would never again refuse medicine simply because a patient lacked money. Clara Bennett slowly regained her strength. The wound still limited movement in her left arm, but each morning she insisted on walking a little farther than the day before. Her determination surprised even her father. One cool morning, she led Nathaniel back toward the same forest where their lives had changed forever. Neither mentioned the accident. Instead, she stopped beside a patch of wildflowers. "You've mistaken yarrow for poison hemlock twice," she said with a faint smile. Nathaniel laughed quietly. "I was hoping you had forgotten. I remember everything. So do I." She knelt carefully beside the plants, using only her healthy arm. Learning herbs isn't about memorizing leaves, it's about patience. Every useful plant grows beside another that can harm you if you hurry. Nathaniel realized she was speaking about far more than medicine. From then on, their walks became lessons. She taught him how wild ginseng preferred deep shade beneath maple roots, how comfrey soothed broken skin, how willow bark eased fever. In return, Nathaniel repaired footbridges, crossing narrow streams, and cleared fallen trees, blocking forgotten trails used by villagers gathering firewood. People noticed the changes. Children who once hid behind fences when the young landowner approached now waved as he rode past. Tenant farmers stopped removing their hats only out of obligation. Some even stopped to talk. Among them was Elijah Turner, a weathered farmer of 55, whose broad frame had been worn thin by decades of failed harvests. His deeply lined face and graying beard reflected years spent battling drought, floods, and debt. Long ago, he had lost his eldest son to a logging accident, a grief that had left him slow to trust anyone promising change. One afternoon, Elijah approached Nathaniel outside the general store. "My father promised repairs for 15 years, he said plainly. "I know. You've done more in 2 months than he did in 10. Nathaniel looked toward the mountains before answering. "I'm not trying to be better than my father. What are you trying to be?" The question lingered. Finally, he replied softly, "Better than I was yesterday." Elijah studied him for several seconds before extending his rough, calloused hand. It was the first handshake Nathaniel had ever received from the old farmer. Weeks later, the annual church picnic gathered nearly every family in the valley. Children played beneath towering oaks, while neighbors shared bread, preserves, and stories beneath white canvas tents. Nathaniel arrived quietly without servants. No one announced him, no one stared. Mrs. Martha Collins, who had once dismissed his promises as empty words, handed him a plate of pie without saying a single skeptical remark. For the first time since the accident, Nathaniel realized something extraordinary had happened. The villagers were no longer looking at the wealthy landowner's son. They were looking at the man he was becoming. Standing beneath the summer sun, Clara watched the conversations unfold around him and understood that compassion had accomplished what wealth never could. Without realizing it, she had become the bridge between the man Nathaniel had been and the man the entire valley was finally beginning to trust. By late August, summer's warmth gave way to damp mountain mornings, and a strange fever began spreading through the scattered farms hidden among Virginia's Blue Ridge hills. It started quietly, with chills and exhaustion, but within days entire households were confined to their beds. Wagons carrying worried families appeared outside Dr. Samuel Bennett's cottage from sunrise until long after dark, leaving the old physician with scarcely enough time to eat or sleep. Dr. Bennett worked until his hands trembled from exhaustion. His silver hair seemed whiter each morning, and the deep lines around his thoughtful gray eyes grew heavier with every patient he visited. Although 62 years old, he refused to turn anyone away. Having buried his own younger brother during a fever epidemic nearly 30 years earlier, he had carried the quiet conviction ever since that no family should face illness alone if he could still stand. Nathaniel Brooks watched the growing crisis with increasing concern. One evening he counted 12 wagons waiting outside the Bennett cottage before darkness had fully settled. By sunrise the next morning he had already made his decision. Every carriage, wagon, and team of horses belonging to the Brooks estate was placed under Dr. Bennett's direction. Stable hands, who normally transported grain, now carried medicine instead. Experienced drivers traveled narrow mountain roads delivering the physician to isolated cabins that had previously been impossible to reach in time. Nathaniel also emptied one of the estate's largest grain warehouses and converted it into a temporary relief station where families could receive medicine, clean blankets, soup, and drinking water without paying a single cent. He gave only one instruction: no one is to ask whether they can afford help. The order spread quickly across the valley. Clara Bennett had regained enough strength to assist her father with preparing herbal remedies, though her injured shoulder still tired easily. She spent long evenings grinding willow bark, drying mint leaves, and measuring simple medicines, while Nathaniel organized supplies beside her. Several nights passed without either of them sleeping more than a few hours. During one quiet moment after midnight, Clara looked across the wooden table at Nathaniel, whose sleeves were rolled to his elbows while he sorted medicine bottles by lantern light. "You've forgotten why you started all this," she said softly. Nathaniel looked up in surprise. "What do you mean?" "You aren't doing this because of me anymore." He remained silent. "You stopped trying to repay a debt weeks ago," Clara continued. "Now you're simply helping people." Nathaniel lowered the small notebook in his hands. For the first time since the accident, he realized she was right. His guilt had led him to her doorstep, but compassion had kept him there. The fever eventually began to retreat. Then, almost as though the valley demanded one final sacrifice, Dr. Bennett collapsed while returning from a distant farmhouse. His body had finally surrendered to weeks of exhaustion. Nathaniel carried the elderly physician into his own bedroom, where Clara examined him with trembling hands before quietly announcing what she already feared. "He has the fever." For 3 days, Nathaniel scarcely left the cottage. He prepared cool cloths, carried water from the well, fed the horses, welcomed anxious patients at the door, and gently persuaded neighboring physicians to care for the remaining sick until Dr. Bennett recovered. Among them arrived Dr. Andrew Collins, a 48-year-old physician from the next county. Tall and lean with sandy hair beginning to gray at the temples, and clean-shaven, features weathered by years of traveling mountain roads, Andrew possessed a calm confidence earned after surviving a devastating influenza outbreak earlier in his career. He examined Dr. Bennett carefully before reassuring Clara. "His heart is strong," he said. "His body is simply asking for the rest he has refused." Nathaniel hardly left the old doctor's bedside. One evening, as golden sunset filtered through the cottage window, Dr. Bennett finally opened his eyes. His fever had broken. He found Nathaniel asleep in the chair beside the bed, still wearing dust work clothes from 2 days earlier. The old physician smiled faintly. "Nathaniel." The young man woke immediately. "Sir?" Dr. Bennett reached out with a weak but steady hand. "I've spent my life judging men by what they do when no one is watching." Nathaniel said nothing. "I watched you." The room fell silent. "I once believed the finest inheritance a father could leave his daughter was security." He paused to catch his breath. "I was mistaken." His tired eyes turned toward Clara before returning to Nathaniel. "The greatest gift is placing her beside a man of character." Nathaniel felt his throat tighten. "I don't deserve such trust." "No man deserves it," Dr. Bennett replied gently. "He chooses every day to become worthy of it." Nathaniel slowly took the old physician's hand. "I cannot erase what my arrow did." "No, but I can promise this." He looked first at Clara, then back to her father. "As long as I live, I will spend my life protecting not only Clara, but every family in this valley that has ever placed its trust in us." Dr. Bennett closed his fingers around Nathaniel's hand. For the first time since the accident in the forest, the promise between them was no longer born from guilt. It was born from purpose. Autumn returned to the Blue Ridge Mountains 1 year later, covering the hillsides with crimson maple leaves, while cool winds carried the scent of harvested wheat across the valley. The same forest where tragedy had begun now stood peaceful beneath golden morning light. Clara Bennett walked its familiar paths once again, her left shoulder fully healed except for a thin scar hidden beneath her sleeve. At 22, she remained graceful and gentle, but there was new confidence in the way she carried herself. She gathered herbs beside her father, not because they lacked help anymore, but because she believed healing began with hands willing to serve others. Much had changed throughout the valley. Nathaniel Brooks had spent the past year reshaping the Brooks estate. Tenant contracts were rewritten with fairer wages. Elderly laborers who could no longer work were allowed to remain in their cottages without fear of eviction, and orphan children found apprenticeships instead of hunger. Every decision reflected lessons he had learned outside the Bennett cottage rather than inside the grand halls of his family's estate. Near the center of town stood the newest symbol of that change. A modest brick clinic had replaced Dr. Samuel Bennett's cramped wooden office. Sunlight filled its wide windows. Clean shelves held medicines once considered too expensive for poor families, and a separate treatment room allowed injured patients to recover in comfort. Nathaniel had quietly paid every construction expense but insisted the wooden sign above the entrance bear only one name: Bennett Community Clinic. When people thanked him, he always answered the same way: "The valley healed me long before I ever helped heal it." Dr. Bennett continued practicing medicine there for several more years. Though age had slowed his steps and silver completely covered his hair, the kindness in his gray eyes never faded. Watching patients leave healthier than they had arrived remained his greatest reward. The story of the stray arrow slowly disappeared from daily conversation, not because people forgot it, because it no longer defined either Nathaniel or Clara. Instead, they remembered the months that followed, the rebuilt roads, the grain shared during difficult seasons, the fever relief station, the countless quiet acts no newspaper would ever print. When the annual Harvest Festival arrived the following October, nearly every family in the valley gathered beside the old white church overlooking the fields. Children laughed while musicians played fiddles beneath decorated oak trees. Farmers displayed pumpkins, apples, and baskets of late vegetables harvested after one of the valley's finest growing seasons. Nathaniel waited until the afternoon speeches had ended. Then he walked toward Clara. The crowd gradually fell silent. She looked at him with curious eyes, unaware of what he intended. Nathaniel stopped only a few feet away. "I once believed responsibility meant repairing a mistake," he said quietly, though every person gathered could hear him. "You taught me it means becoming someone who makes fewer mistakes because he has learned to love people more than himself." He reached into his coat pocket and removed a small velvet box. "I cannot promise you a perfect life," he smiled gently. "I've already proved that." Soft laughter spread through the crowd. "But I can promise that every decision I make for the rest of my life will begin with the question you unknowingly taught me to ask." He paused. "Will this make someone else's life better?" He opened the box. Inside rested a simple gold ring. "Clara Bennett, would you honor me by becoming my wife?" Tears filled Clara's hazel eyes before she could answer. "Yes," she whispered. Then, smiling through those tears, she repeated louder, "Yes." The church bell began ringing before anyone had planned it. Someone started applauding. Within moments, the entire valley joined them. They were married 3 months later inside the small hilltop church overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains. There were no extravagant decorations, no lavish banquet, and no display of wealth. Wildflowers gathered by neighborhood children lined the pews, while farmers, laborers, merchants, and families filled every seat. No one sat according to social standing. Everyone sat together. Years passed peacefully. Dr. Bennett eventually retired from medicine, leaving the clinic in the capable hands of younger physicians, while Clara continued treating patients with the same compassion her father had taught her. Nathaniel expanded charitable programs across the county, funding schools, repairing bridges, and ensuring no family was left hungry during difficult winters. The Brooks estate gradually became known not as the richest land in the region, but as the fairest. Long afterward, when strangers asked the elderly residents of the valley how such remarkable change had begun, they never spoke first about the clinic, or the harvests, or the wedding. They smiled. Then they pointed toward the distant forest, where rain once fell through silent trees. It all started, they would say, with a young man's arrow and the courage to carry far more than the weight of the girl he accidentally wounded. For in the end, the arrow had not merely changed 2 lives. It had transformed an entire valley by teaching one man that true greatness is never measured by wealth, but by the lives made better, because he chose to take responsibility when it mattered most. As this story comes to an end, perhaps its greatest lesson isn't about a single arrow, but about what happened afterward. One unexpected mistake did not define a person's future. The choices made with honesty, compassion, and quiet perseverance did. In our own lives, we may never face the same circumstances, but we all have moments when we can choose responsibility over excuses, kindness over pride, and hope over regret. Sometimes, the smallest act of care becomes the beginning of a completely different story, not only for someone else, but for ourselves as well. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments. What moment moved you the most, and what lesson will you carry into your own life? If you believe stories like this can inspire someone you love, please share this video with your family and friends. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about kindness, faith, courage, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel and join our growing community. Thank you for spending your time with us today. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, and fill your home with peace, good health, and hope. Until next time, take care, and God bless.